Hey guys, this is Drew from the Bastard Sword Podcast. With the recent discourse surrounding Hellblade 2, the ways it pushes visual fidelity forward, and how much that adds to the overall experience, we thought this discussion from last month would be relevant and hopefully interesting. We talk about visual fidelity versus art direction, the graphics arms race, which I just totally made up, but I like the term, so I'm sticking with it, and how much realistic graphics actually add to the overall experience of a game. We hope you enjoy. Feel free to let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.
Speaking of graphics, I think you wanted to jump topics and segue into talking about graphics in general here.
Kind of, yeah. So we're talking about Metal Gear, and I've been bouncing around the subject for a little while anyway, but especially revisiting them, it made me kind of consider a couple things. One, video game graphics in general, it seems to me that they've plateaued to an extent and that progress is definitely a lot more incremental than it used to be. It's not like, the 2D to 3D era or going from like PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2 was a giant leap. Now it's a PlayStation 5 game versus a PlayStation 4 game is going to be better, but in a lot of ways that aren't necessarily quite as obvious. And I was just kind of curious, one, if you agree, and if you kind of think there's a point at which we started reaching diminishing returns in the graphics arm race.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And as someone who just replayed Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and felt some of the limitations of that build of a game inside Unreal, I do think that we're kind of getting to that point. I definitely think that developers now, especially with like extremely realistic graphics, like have to figure out where to cut corners to keep a game stable. That's kind of why I'm referencing the newest Final Fantasy title. I'm an art style guy. I like a good art style heavy game that can carry everything visually. It works really well in Breath of the Wild, even kind of going back to like a game like Okami or something like that. I'm going to keep going back to Final Fantasy VII, but it had a lot of lighting limitations. And it seems like if you make a linear game that way, you can make it more stable and say like Last of Us remake or Last of Us 2, where all the pieces fall in line in a way that it's really clean and polished. I think it's getting harder for like these giant games though, these giant open world 50 to 70 hour titles.
Right, yeah, and the industry is sort of working against itself because the games keep getting bigger and bigger while the graphics are getting more and more detailed down to these tiny minuscule little details that just end up taking hundreds upon hundreds of man hours to jam into these hundreds and hundreds of hours of content. It's just these giant bloated messes that end up taking like a Grand Theft Auto 6 10-year development time or whatever. And to me, I don't know, a lot of that stuff, I like Digital Foundry. I think they seem like cool guys. I like watching their content occasionally. I cannot imagine caring that much about the technicalities and the, what's the word I'm thinking of here? My brain is completely blanked out. Oh no.
The performance?
No. See, I think performance definitely is better than fidelity for me. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at.
Exactly.
I cannot imagine caring that much about the graphical fidelity of a game. I play a lot of older games, and I'm not necessarily impressed by super intricately detailed, hyper-realistic graphics. Definitely not as much as an art style. To me, it's just kind of a matter of if it looks good enough. And for me, kind of around the PlayStation 2 to original Xbox era is where things started looking good enough that it's not distracting for the most part, just an average game. And even some with good art style, like you mentioned, Okami, still hold up and look genuinely really good these days. And then around the Xbox 360 era, notwithstanding some gripes about the art style and the overuse of bloom and the color brown but
the brown filters.
Yeah, but notwithstanding that, in terms of pure fidelity, an average Xbox 360 game can look totally fine to really good to me. And I just what was that one tweet going around that was like, I want games that are shorter and cost more and look worse and were easier to develop or something?
Yeah.
I'm kind of on board with that, because the things that have come out recently to me that are actually graphically impressive to the extent that it adds something to the experience all have to do with the art style and aren't necessarily just sheer like number of polygons and individual hairs rendered, just pushed out to the extreme. Like, look at, Elden Ring looks amazing in places, and technically it's kind of a mess. I mean, FromSoft is not great at optimization or anything, but their art style is just phenomenal. And same thing with like Ghost of Tsushima. It is a technically impressive game in a few ways, but it's not overly so. I mean, just on a sheer technical level, everything is actually pretty basic and clean. It just has an amazing art style that manages to make everything stand out super well. And I don't know. I feel like in general, I just don't like what I'll go back to calling it the graphics arm race is doing. I definitely prefer things that just look good enough. I don't know. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I mean, especially with like an extremely detailed game, I want that to like reflect in the game. Metal Gear games kind of spoiled me with that. Just the amount of detail and interactions and little things that they considered within the world of those games. It just kind of like will feel clunky when you have this like really polished main character and all the NPCs are kind of scuffed over. The lines of inconsistency start to show a little bit, whereas you have something like The Last of Us Part 2 where it's just incredibly detailed, and you're basically going down a hallway in most of the game, but because of that linearity they can make those encounters like more realistic, and like this is a raining scene of the game, so like everyone's wet. The way they utilize that in the engine is really, really great.
And even with Metal Gear, it's Kojima, and we'll get into this a little more later, but Kojima is really good about pushing the system. The Metal Gear games are almost all big showpieces, graphical showpieces for the console, but even that's not necessarily on a super technical level, although it is technically impressive what they can pull off on like a PlayStation 2, but that's mostly because of a really good art direction and just a really solid vision, which again is much more important than just seeing how many polygons you can push and how detailed you can make everything,
and being able to balance that within the engine. Because again, like Death Stranding, especially the upgraded director's cut version, the graphics are really good and polished, and everything is very stable. It's like I've never had like any major bugs in that game. It's a balancing act, and I feel like especially as people are pushing forward with graphical fidelity, we're starting to, we've been seeing for a while these games that come out on release and they're kind of scuffed because they're trying to make so much work, and it's too much even for a PS5 or newest console, at least our current console.
Yeah, and the other point that I kind of had in mind that I wanted to mention, it seems like right now what we're doing, like going from the PS4 to PS5 era and all this, is heavy investment into actually doing things that we've been faking for a while. So like with ray tracing, actually real-time ray tracing all these reflections and lighting and everything. Yep. Whereas before they were just pre-baked and they looked really good for the most part if the direction was there, but now we're just able to do them in real time and make them look about 10% more convincing at the cost of about 80% of the performance.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think Doom Eternal was like one of the first games to really like lean into that. They knew that was going to be a pretty game, although it does also hold up like a very intentional art style.
Yeah, and they were very conscious of the performance with it too, so it's kind of, I guess, one of the exceptions that proves the rule.
Yeah, it does. They optimize that game pretty well. In terms of like experience, I keep looking over Rise of Ronin because I don't really like how it looks. And I think if I got my hands on it and it was a fun, enjoyable game, I probably wouldn't care too much about how it looks. Yeah, when you compare that to something like Ghost of Tsushima, what really sells like those graphics is like the animation too.
Oh yeah.
So like the way the wind blows across the plains and the cherry blossoms and all that, like that just works really well. And I think more developers need to like take a look at that when they're designing, like creating that experience within a space. I know some developers probably don't care about that at all, but I think it really sells it.
It goes a long ways, yeah. And like in Ghost of Tsushima, they are just so smart about the leaves blowing across the screen. They just always have some kind of particles or like objects just blowing around and just adding a lot of texture and depth to the scene. And like Rise of Ronin probably actually is I haven't looked into it a whole lot, but I would imagine it has some things more technically advanced than Ghost of Tsushima, just given that it's a native PS5 game, but it just doesn't look like it because the art direction just isn't necessarily there.
Yeah, that you just reminded me of something that's been bugging me with these types of games. As we try to get more realistic with these graphics, there's this need to use like realistic lighting in a lot of situations. We kind of have this problem in movies too, where, you know, it's like a scene that's happening at night and you can't see shit.
Right.
And you have no detail on the characters, or everything's in shadow, so it looks uglier. And I really hate that when you have these games that do have good lighting systems, but they intentionally drove on to like realistic light rays from the sky or whatever the setting is. The Final Fantasy games really have this problem, and it's shown more in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but also Final Fantasy 16, where you had this great color palette, great design, great models, and then they're in shadow all the time.
Right.
And that really kills the vibe for me. I wish they would just like either put like a lighting source beside the character, like as an add-on, like part of the game or something, or, you know, resolve these areas where, especially in Rebirth, you go in and out of areas and there's like a blast of light, or it'll be extremely dark, and the lighting has to level out for some reason. That kind of took me out of it a few times, but I still pushed on. It wasn't like the worst thing, but I just wish they would improve that.
Yeah, just little minor annoyances and things. Similarly, visual readability is kind of a thing that gets sacrificed in a lot of the super higher end type of games visually. Even on Dark Souls, like Dark Souls 3 is not the most technically advanced game or anything, but compared to the original Dark Souls, it's got a lot more of that environmental clutter everywhere, and at times it actually just kind of turns into noise and starts to kind of blend together and make the environment stand out less and the enemies stand out less and everything just kind of stand out a little less than they did on the older game that technically has worse graphics, but everything's just a little more easy to read at a glance.
Yeah, they also stepped up their color palettes.
Yes.
I know a lot of people argue that Dark Souls 3 was intentionally gray and the world's dying, etc. But it's clear with Elden Ring and Armored Core 6 that they have figured out how to use their color palettes to make the game look really, really pretty, as long as you're not looking too close. I mean, if you want to pick it apart, they're kind of behind like the big wigs, you know, the heavy hitters.
Yeah, which is fine by me.
Yeah, the art style just looks beautiful. So yeah, they've started to nail that with color schemes.
Yeah, which is exactly just kind of where I want things to be. I want all games to be Dark Souls or Elden Ring, I guess.
Yes, there we go.
We'll go with that.
Yeah, spend more time on the game and
just get it looking good enough, man.